Scholars, for a very long time, especially New Testament scholars, have been reluctant to call books in the New Testament or even other books forgeries because it's such a loaded term in modern parlance. And so most New Testament scholars call that phenomenon pseudepigraphy. What most people would call forgery, they call pseudepigraphy. They do that for a couple reasons. One is it doesn't sound offensive. Another is that nobody knows what it means. And so that's why it doesn't sound offensive. But if people were actually told what it means, they probably would be offended. Pseudepigraphy means it's a book that's inscribed with a lie, meaning the author's claiming to be somebody that he's not. It was shocking when you add it up. For a number of years, I talked about pseudepigraphy in the New Testament and never bothered to add it up. When you do, you say, wait a second, there are 27 books in the New Testament. How many of them do we know, written by the person who claims to be the author? Well, there are, in the New Testament, there are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul. And scholars are pretty sure that 7 of them actually were written by Paul. So much so, this is so widespread among scholarship that very commonly scholars will just talk about the undisputed Pauline letters. And what they mean by that is it's undisputed who wrote them. It's a little bit of a stretch, of course, because scholars debate everything, and so nothing is undisputed technically. But basically, everybody agrees that Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon were written by Paul, and the others either possibly not, or probably not, or almost certainly not. So you got those 7. The other book, interestingly, is the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, which claims to be written by somebody named John. And almost everybody thinks, yeah, somebody named John wrote it. It's wrong to say probably that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote it, that the disciple of Jesus wrote it, but it doesn't claim to be written by John, the son of Zebedee. It's just some guy named John, and it was a very common name. So that's usually counted as an orthonymous work as well.
Why is so much of the New Testament in that category?
Yeah, good question. The actual forgeries, the things I would call forgeries, where people say they're somebody when they're not. When you have authors claiming to be Paul, writing Ephesians and Colossians and 2nd Thessalonians, when they almost certainly were not Paul. And by the way, there are reasons for this. This isn't just kind of crazy stuff that scholars throw out there. They're actually very, very detailed studies of all these. And if anybody wants to see a really detailed study, my book that you mentioned earlier, Forgery and Counterforgery, goes through each one of these individually and shows why it looks like it wasn't written by that person. So those people who are claiming to be Paul, or the people claiming to be Peter, or the person claiming to be James, or these ones that claim somebody who probably did not write them, almost certainly are doing this because they think they've got an important message to convey, and they're somebody that nobody's ever heard of, and so nobody will read their book, but it's an important message, and so they claim to be somebody famous, so that their book will be read. And in all these cases, they were terrifically successful because today billions of people are convinced. And so it's a very effective ploy. Whereas people who wrote books in their own names that nobody ever heard of, they didn't get copied or read. So that's why you probably have so many forgeries. And as we said in our other episode, this was a common practice in the ancient world. It's not like this is unusual in the New Testament. This is a common practice.
So what about the books that have been or falsely attributed to a specific author? Why does that happen?
Well, it happens for a similar reason. Suppose you've got a bunch of gospels in the 2nd century, which you do have. There were a number of gospels floating around about Jesus' life, and there were some of them that church fathers didn't like, church leaders thought were heretical or just not very good, or whatever. But there were others that they said these are really authoritative, and they're the ones that we should use for understanding who Jesus was. But they're anonymous, and if you have an authority for Jesus, you want the authority to be an author who knew what he was talking about. And so they get attributed to 2 of the disciples, Matthew and John, and to 2 of the companions of apostles, Peter, the companion of Peter, and Luke, the companion of Paul. And so So false attributions are almost always to increase the authority of the writing so that it'll be read and considered authoritative.
So if we take the New Testament and we remove all of the books that academics have determined are forgeries or misattributions, what does that do? How does that change the message of the New Testament?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you take out the false attributions, if you just get rid of them, the thing is, you wouldn't get rid of the false attributions. You would still say, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If somebody convinces you, this Matthew really was not written by the tax collector who is a follower of Jesus, and suppose you become convinced of that, you wouldn't get rid of it. You would just say, okay, well, it's called something wrong. But if somebody says, this book of Ephesians is somebody who's saying that he's Paul, but he's not, he's lying about it, then you might say, man, I don't know if I want lies in the New Testament, and you might get rid of it. If you got rid of Ephesians, it would change things. And for all of these books, I'll just pick two of Paul's books, Ephesians and Second Thessalonians. For Ephesians, Ephesians is a book that emphasizes that people have already experienced a kind of heavenly existence here on earth because they've accepted Christ, and that they're already living a heavenly existence, and so that you have and to some extent you have the rewards of heaven now already. That's the opposite of what Paul himself thought, but it's a view that's widely held among people today, that we're already enjoying God's grace, and so it's manifest to us in these wonderful ways today because of how glorious my life is now, and that can find support in Ephesians, but it won't find support in Paul, who believes that this age is an age of suffering for those who are on God's side. With Second Thessalonians, that's an interesting one because in a concrete way, Second Thessalonians is the one book of the New Testament that says that before Jesus comes back, the Antichrist figure has to go into the temple of God and declare that he is God. And that'll happen before the end. This is the verse that fundamentalists use to say that the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. And so this has fueled the interest of fundamentalist Christians in Israel taking over the Temple Mount and destroying the Dome of the Rock and building the temple again so that Jesus can come back. That would be serious. But it's all based on this verse in Second Thessalonians that claims to be written by Paul, but is not.
Would the removal of the books have an impact on more moral debates that we see among Christians today?
Among moral debates, it's interesting because some of these books are fairly emphatic about issues about like how slaves ought to obey their masters. Rather than masters, you should free your slaves. And so some of these books, like, if you have been used to justify slavery. One book that I think in particular has been problematic for the modern situation among Christians and probably Western culture more broadly, more until recently, is First Timothy. In First Timothy chapter 2, there's this rather infamous passage that where the author, claiming to be Paul, even though he's almost certainly not, tells women that they are to be quiet and not to exercise any authority over a man. And that men are to rule the roost, not just in church and not just at home, but like everywhere, because especially in a married relationship, because Adam was created first. Eve was just kind of an afterthought, and she was created to help the man. She's not created to rule the man. And she's the reason that so many problems are in the world now, because she's the one who got tempted and ate the fruit and then gave her husband to eat. And so this is what happens when you let women exercise authority over men. They get deceived by the devil and they lead them into sin. And so you can't have that. So women have to be subject to men. So that's not good, but it's in one of these books that is not really written by Paul, that claims to be by Paul. And it's one of the main reasons that people today still widely call Paul a misogynist, because of a book that he didn't write. What scholars have realized over the last 100 or 150 years is that authors of the New Testament themselves are at odds on major issues and are arguing points that are different from the issues that others argue. Just to give you one example, I've mentioned both Matthew and Paul. Paul insists that followers of Jesus do not have to follow the law. And so if somebody's a Gentile, they don't have to convert to Judaism, they don't have to get circumcised, they don't have to keep kosher, they don't have to observe the Sabbath, they don't have to keep the Jewish law. Read Matthew sometime and see what that says. Matthew says you have to keep the law better than the scribes and the Pharisees. Your righteousness has to be more than theirs, or you won't get into the kingdom of heaven. Not one letter, not one part of a letter will pass away before all the law is accomplished, and you have to keep it all. Later in Matthew, the author says that you are to do everything the Pharisees tell you to do. This is chapter 23, verse 2. So the Pharisees have, kind of these strict interpretations of the Torah, the law. You have to do those, Jesus says. The problem with the Pharisees is that they don't do what they say they should do. But what they say to do is right. Would Paul say that? I don't think so. And so I think just about all of these books have some kind of issue that they're really finding important precisely because other Christians disagree with them on it.
If they're finding these issues to be important, why include other books that directly contradict them?
Right. This is a really good question, and I get asked this a lot. Look, if they're at, if Matthew and Paul don't agree, why'd they include both of them? Well, okay, good. Well, first of all, who's the they? The they are the people in the ancient world who thought that they were both important books. Today, there are 2 billion people, at least, who think they are important books. How many of those 2 billion have read Matthew and read Paul and thought that they're at odds with each other? Like precisely almost, 0.01%. Just a few scholars who pay attention to these things. People just don't notice this kind of thing. If you've got books that people tell you are authoritative, then you simply assume that they're basically on the same page. And that's especially the case when you put them between 2 covers. Because then it's one book, not 27 books. And so you just assume if everything's between 2 covers that it's all the same. And in the ancient world, they didn't have the 2 covers, but they had collections of books. And if you have a collection of the Gospels and collection of Paul, you just assume they're the same. But the other thing that happens is that when church fathers decide which books are going to be in the New Testament, even when they realized that they're different from each other, they also realize that if you put them together and think about them as one book by one author, they're all written by God, they're not written by different authors. If you think that, then it takes the edges off of each one, because you have to read Matthew in light of Paul and Paul in light of Matthew. When Matthew was writing, he wasn't planning on you comparing him to Paul and doing that. He's planning on you reading Matthew. When Paul was writing before Matthew, he wasn't planning on you comparing his writings to somebody else later. But once you put them in the same canon, then you more or less are forced to interpret them in light of each other, and it rubs off most of their differences.
If you're going to go out and evangelize, then you also need to be prepared to be evangelized too, and maybe change your mind at some point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, before we finish for the week, would you mind just summarizing what we spoke about today?
Well, we were talking about this kind of startling phenomenon that most of the New Testament is not written by people who are claimed as the authors. In some instances, there are authors who actually claim to be a famous person when they know full well they're not that person. Whoever wrote 2 Peter, it almost certainly wasn't Peter. Whoever wrote 1 Timothy was almost certainly not Paul, claiming to be Paul. And so you have that. And that's what modern people would call forgery, when somebody claims to be a famous person they're not when they're writing. Other books are attributed to people who probably did not write them, or almost certainly didn't write them. So, the 4 Gospels, for example, the book of Acts, they're claimed for somebody that the person himself doesn't make the claim. So that's a startling phenomenon. And we were talking about why that's significant. I mean, partly because there are, a lot of books in the New Testament that are like that, and partly because some of the things set out in these books have become very important within Christian circles historically and still today. And it's worth knowing who actually said these